Good evening. My name is Connery, and I am a student of international relations, specifically as it pertains to international security. This is INR 3333, and this is my final project. Today I'm covering an analysis of cyber warfare and its social implications. So, the first thing that I want to cover is the definition and the origin of cyber warfare. One of the first questions that is asked when it comes to this specific topic is, what is cyber warfare and what forms does it come in, along with, is it cyber warfare or is it cyber attacking? What counts and who does it? So, cyber attacking is the sophisticated cyber actors and nation states exploit vulnerabilities to steal information and money from developing capabilities to disrupt, destroy, or threaten the delivery of essential services. So this is the very simple definition of cyber attacking in general and cyber warfare. So the question is, does cyber warfare exist? Well, according to NATO and a couple of the people that work for NATO, no, it does not. Technically speaking, it's not a valid form of warfare since it doesn't involve any military personnel and no lives are lost. However, there are differing opinions. But before we go into that, we're going to go into more about the definition of cyber aggression along with cyber attacking. So, first question is, what kinds of cyber aggression exist? The first type is often espionage. It's the most common type. That's the type that's been attributed to the Chinese hacking between the Chinese and the US, and it's often the most common form because it's between interstate governments. But the most common forms are espionage, computer crime, sabotage, hacktivism, and subversion. The question is, who does it? Well, it's kind of a complicated answer. The answer simply, though, is while anybody can technically be a cyber aggressor and can commit cyber hacking, generally speaking, it's either a lone person, a political organization, or it's an actual state actor. A lot of times, state actors will kind of subcontract these hacking techniques to private citizens so that they have culpable deniability. However, additionally, there is a new form of cyber aggression, and it's called hacktivism, which is a little bit different from traditional terrorism or cyber terrorism, if you want to call it that. And this actually involves the use of hacking for advancing one's own political or ideological motives beyond inciting political fear. Simply put, it's just a different type because it doesn't use actual political fear in order to achieve the objective. It merely will impede someone else's political objective. So it's not technically terrorism by definition. The next thing that I want to cover is an analysis of recent cyber aggression. I want to go over the history of it, and I want to give you a little bit more of a background so that you all can understand how this problem arose and so that we can figure out the solutions. So, due to the rapid evolution of most technological capabilities, thanks to the internet and the globalization of technology and most economies, and the interdependence caused by the internet, most large-scale cyber attacks have occurred within the past 15 years. This is primarily because in the past 15 years, most companies and governments have actually transferred all their paper documents into technological documents, and as a result, they're easier to hack. They're easier to get a hold of, and so therefore, it's easier to hack them. So, according to the Department of Homeland Security, there are a range of traditional crimes that are actually being committed currently through the internet, through the use of cyberspace, and one of these is hacking. And this includes the production and distribution of child pornography, banking and financial fraud, intellectual property violations, and other general crimes that usually involve financial fraud or intellectual property theft. These also have major economic consequences because there are multiple companies that have already been hacked and they've lost millions of dollars, along with the government who's also lost some key, cutting-edge technology because of the fact that they've been hacked. So, what are the risks associated with hacking? Well, the key to understanding cyber attacking is that it's very guerrilla warfare. The problem is that because the state system is very anarchic in nature, although there is interdependence, it is very anarchic. And so as a result, it tends to be guerrilla style. Because of the fact that you don't have traditional casualties like in war, sometimes governments will be a little more willing to give up some collateral damage. And as you're about to see in the following list, there are going to be terabytes of sensitive data that's been breached through cyber attacks. And, while not all of these are devastating necessarily, The concern is that there is going to be a larger one if the smaller ones are possible. And of course, the most direct risks associated with cyber attacks, as I mentioned, are potential breach of government privacy. And that can include confidential information between actual government employees, or it could actually be intellectual property, could be weapons technology, could be energy development, could be really anything at all. Sometimes hackers will just hack to get innocuous information, just to get a rise of the government, and to make them feel insecure. So, the next thing that I'm going to go over is recently documented hacking and cyber aggression incidences. So these are going to be the specific incidences and their actual, outcomes. So one of the first ones, it started primarily in August 2006. That was when the primary issues between the U.S. and actual cyber aggressors began. The reason why is because around this time, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. government took the majority of their paper documents and digitized them. As a result, China has decided to take an interest in this. Because of the fact that cyber hacking is not traditionally considered a method of warfare, China can technically hack the U.S. as much as they want it. In this specific project, I'm actually covering the issue as it pertains to the United States and China, but more as an example to cover the broader topic of what cyber aggression is, more as a general example. So, of course, we've had some in October 2007, and as you'll notice with this list, it's not just China who's hacking. Unfortunately, the U.S. is also hacking. The question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Grand old debate, but unfortunately, that answer is kind of complicated. You know, the United States is going to claim that, of course, they're always the victim, and traditionally, and just as on the opposite side, China is going to claim that they're the victim as well. Both sides are claiming that the other is the perpetrator, that they are the victim, and that they are merely, retaliating because of the fact that they've been hacked first. So apparently that justifies it. And a lot of this, as you can see, are not particularly important pieces of information in the sense that they're not a threat to national security. They're not the nuclear codes. They're not the key location of our military bases that might be hidden. Not any specific hardware that we're aware of that's been stolen per se. We don't know that. However, still a problem. As you can see here, these are some of the more recent cases. The most recent that's been documented by this source is on June 18th, which is when Chinese government hackers compromised a Navy contractor. They stole 614 gigabytes of data related to weapons. The concern is that potentially some of that hardware or some of that software is actually sensitive information and could potentially be a threat to us in the sense that we would no longer have private information, specifically as it pertains to technology. The other concern, as you can see, it also took data from communication systems and United States submarines, which of course is very concerning. So, cyber attacking and its implications from the perspective of a neo-realist. I decided to take two paradigms for this final project, the neo-realist and the critical security studies aspects. The reason why I chose these two is because, especially in the textbooks and in our curriculum, both Stephen Walt and Ken Booth are considered general ideological adversaries and generally don't have any overlapping beliefs. The reason why I chose this is, of course, I want to provide a solid contrast for what the issue is and how we frame it. So, as they have asked Walt in an actual interview, which is what the source is from, is cyber warfare real? According to Steve Walt, cyber warfare barely exists in theory and can't really exist in the direct sense because it's not an act of war. Of course, World War III hasn't occurred, so we can assume that no significant breaches have occurred to the point where it would be considered war. Question is, can cyber attacks be committed in a sense of being an act of war? Technically speaking, the only scenario in which it would be reasonable for a neo-realist to accept the fact that a cyber attack was an act of war would be if it compromises military personnel, loss of life, perhaps the destruction of property, but likelihood is it would require an actual death, more or less. That is what generally will start an actual war. So, this is a continuation of Steve Walt's perspective on neo-realism and its and cyber aggression. So, if China were to hack into the Department of Defense's security systems and gain access to the United States nuclear codes, that would be considered an act of war if they were to launch them. Technically speaking, According to Steve Wall, unless there's an actual physical threat to the boundaries of the nation state, as is considered by neorealism, you can't necessarily declare it a war or an act of war. However, this is somewhat of a gray area for a lot of scholars. The question is, at what point is it an act of war? Is it a compromisation of hardware? Is it a compromisation of personnel? What does that include? According to Steve Wall, it's a very black and white definition, simply stating that unless you have an actual attack on your soil, it is not considered an act of war. So that's something to consider, especially when we look at Ken Booth next. But before we look at Ken Booth, we have to ask, what about China, right? Because that is the example, after all. So even in the case of China, where there's substantial evidence to make the claim the government has launched, encouraged cyber attacks against the United States, a neorealist can't consider it an actual act of war because of the fact that no loss of life has occurred, or at least not directly. Potentially indirectly, that is possible. But technically speaking, by the neorealist terms, that wouldn't quite qualify. So, of course, we're going to cover Ken Booth, who is a critical security studies scholar, considered one of the founding fathers of this kind of ideology of the Copenhagen school, and a very influential thinker in this Copenhagen school. So, from a critical security studies perspective, cyber warfare is very real, and it has serious social implications. While a critical security scholar would agree that that cyber warfare is not necessarily a traditional approach to warfare, they would consider the majority of cyber attacks that we experience today to be acts of war. So we might ask, should cyber attacks be considered legitimate acts of war? Well, seeing that they are generally concerned with not only the physical boundary safety of the nation state, but also the actual health and of the population, along with the health of the population of the rest of the world, generally any cyber attack that would compromise the health and well-being of an actual nation state would be considered an act of war by default. And not only that, it would be considered to be a securitizable issue because of the fact that it actually threatens the nation state's citizens and multiple nation state citizens. This can also become a securitizable interest if it were to involve another topic such as environmental regulation or something like that. Same thing with critical security studies. Anytime that you have an issue that affects the population of the world or a specific country, it then becomes more or less a securitizable topic. So, therefore, any cyber attack that poses any kind of threat to the security of anybody, including a nation state or a citizen, can technically be considered an act of warfare. Question is, what about China? Does that count? So, especially in the instance where two nation states engage in the exchange of state-sponsored attacks, and especially when they're mutual attacks, cyber attacks definitely can qualify as a type of warfare, but probably not in the martial sense, probably closer to what we would consider a diplomatic war of sorts, almost a way for states to have discourse, which is an interesting way to think about it. But nonetheless, they can consider an act of war if it compromises somebody, if it compromises their security. So, although not all of them have been sanctioned by the entirety of their governments, they have presented clear risk for the parties involved, so then by default, they can be considered an act of war. And this, of course, doesn't mention the implications that war-inducing diplomacy methods have on other nation states and citizens, which could also lead it to be a securitizable topic. So, the question is, how do we fix this problem? It's a rampant problem. It's occurred between multiple countries. As you can see in some of the previous charts in this slideshow, it is a very serious problem, and it's had an increasing rate of frequency. So the question is, how do we solve it? Now, I've got some bad news for you. Hacking and cyber aggression are extremely complex issues. They're extremely tough to tackle. And the reason why is because a lot of times hackers will conceal their identity by using obfuscated servers, which are also known as onion servers, or even person-to-person software can be used in order to hide the identity of the internet address that they're using. If you can hide the internet address that you're using, you basically are untraceable and, for the most part, uncatchable. So the question is, so can nothing be done? Well, not quite that simple. Something can be done, but it's not necessarily a direct solution that we would necessarily consider to be 100% effective. The only effective way to combat this kind of problem is by either starting a legitimate ground war, in the sense of you can dominate your opponent till they no longer attack you. But that, of course, would not be viewed as a very plausible answer to both the neo-realist and to the actual critical security scholar, because only the realists generally are interested in flexible response, where you have one nation state, one-upping the other. And it's just a constant one-upmanship. So since neo-realists are into that, but don't consider it an act of war, they can't really consider flexible response to be a plausible answer. Some will, but generally not. Also, critical security scholars would not suggest going to war or legitimizing or acknowledging it as an act of war, because then you run into a gray area of, is the war justified, and you could run into some serious global problems with disapproval. So the most reasonable answer that I've seen that actually seems plausible to the majority of the sides and is actually implementable to a certain degree is actually came from a U.S. News article. And although it's not necessarily a scholarly article, unfortunately, there weren't really a lot of scholarly articles or journals that I found that specifically pertain to the solutions, but rather the underlying problems of the situation. So they weren't very effective in giving me a clear answer as to what should be done. However, this specific article did have a suggestion, which in STEM Cyber War Now, they suggest a somewhat of a co-op, an international cyber stability co-op, which ideally would be between prominent countries, similar to the United Nations Security Council, how you have the permanent members in order to keep everybody in check, especially the ones that you don't trust, because you want to keep them close. Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. This ideally should help cyber aggression because of the fact that you have global interdependence. Not only that, but you have more countries holding each other accountable, which means that, generally speaking, economic sanctions can be based behind these, and a lot of times these are effective measures for nation states in order to curb their behavior, even in cases as extreme as Russia or China, where even the stability of the leader itself is questioned. However, unfortunately, this complex issue doesn't have a lot of other standards. The other thing that the American government has invested in is, of course, a cyber aggression task force, which deals with cyber aggression. The problem with this solution is that if you have any domestic solutions, they're not going to be very effective. For the reason that I mentioned earlier, which is the obfuscated and onion servers, which basically prevent hackers from ever being traced, especially if they're a Chinese government-sanctioned hacker. The government is not going to let you find out that they were the ones hacking. They're definitely not going to let you find out either that the Chinese government was the one who sponsored the hacking. So as a result, you have to find a way to keep everybody happy, but also keep everybody secure. And of course, the real answer at the end of the day is to create interdependence. If you create interdependence, then by default, you pretty much have a pretty solid system. It's not foolproof. This isn't going to stop other countries from attempting small, menial hacking attempts. This is not going to stop them, of course. But what this will do is make them more hesitant because of the fact that they know that other people are onto them. If we continue to go on in a system where we merely ignore the threat posed by these security issues and we just simply treat them as isolated incidents and not acts of diplomatic war, as we'll call them, because they're not technically acts of war unless you're a critical security scholar. But if we were to make it more of an intimidating accusation than merely, oh, you had one citizen try and hack us, don't do it again, this would be a more effective means for communicating that message. Also, with, like I said, the solution that involves international cooperation, this is, of course, extremely complex. But, however, this would provide a solid structure to the anarchic type state that we experience. While not all agree that this state is of anarchy, most agree that there is a certain level of anarchy due to the lack of international law. Most people agree with that. So the only other solution, as I said, would be to take a neo-realist approach and treat each incident as an isolated one with no international retaliation required. Now, you could try this. However, of course, this is going to put you on the defense. You will never be able to be on the offense. But even if you were on the offense, you would never be in the right. You would never be justified, and you would never be a victim. Because if it's not an act of war, you can't be considered a victim, right? So in that sense, we would either have to define it as an act of war or that no one is ever a victim, which means that retaliation is never a correct option. However, the US government hasn't really agreed with that option because of the fact that even under the Obama administration, there were government-sanctioned hacking events wherein actual hackers tried to hack the Chinese government. This is relatively accepted, and I even have a couple of sources that are in my annotated bibliography or reference sheet, which is about to come up in a little bit, that will explain this a little bit further if you're interested in hearing about that. And as you can see here, of course, all of my works cited. I wanted to make sure that I included a lot of government websites. I wanted to see what the American government had to say about it. Interestingly, they took a very realist approach, definitely not a security scholar approach. And the interesting thing is that the policy of government, especially when it comes to cyber aggression, doesn't seem to change much regardless of the administration that it's in. Sometimes the cyber retaliation will get more aggressive or less aggressive. However, there haven't been any recent campaigns that have openly advocated against cyber retaliation. So that's actually something to be concerned about, in the sense that no matter what political thought you are of, no matter what, a lot of times the people within your own political organizations or affiliations are actually not agreeing with you. And there aren't many people who are critical security scholars in the United States government. And if they are, they tend to be in more of the social realm or the domestic realm, creating social or securitized topics as it pertains to things like healthcare or reproductive rights in general, things of that nature that don't tend to be as polarizing as warfare can be, because it's such a serious topic with such high direct stakes. Also, I wanted to include a couple of news sources to see what they had to say about the solution and the problem, to see if they had a different perspective. They took a more critical security scholar approach to this, and they really went after the idea that these are real wars and real discrepancies with actual consequences, and as a result, we should treat it more seriously than we are currently treating it. Although a lot of them do not condone the idea of treating it as a direct act of war, a lot of them in their solutions, especially the solutions like a co-op, do acknowledge that there is a certain war-producing aspect within this cyber attacking topic and this issue in general. Additionally, of course, I wanted to include some academic resources. I included a couple of resources between the typical authors of both the neo-realist and the critical security studies approach, as you can see in these. And overall, I try to create a holistic approach to this, but unfortunately, it's such a complex issue that a lot of times people are not very confident in presenting a solution or accepting a solution because of how complex the problem is and the competing interests at stake. I hope you enjoyed my presentation today, and I thank you for watching.